Hi. So I'm Leor, I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London. My main focus of the PhD was the visual experience, but I'm actually going to talk about psilocybin therapy today, which is where my research is right now. Psilocybin is the active compound of magic mushrooms, and we're using it in the lab to treat treatment-resistant depression. I'm going to talk about the peak experience or the mystical experience and how it relates to clinical outcomes. And I'm going to talk about changes in the amygdala. So these are two different sections of this lecture. So I'm going to start. This is our therapy room. This is the transformation of the therapy room. And of course, this is already kind of showing that we're doing something completely different. And it's obvious to everybody that's kind of dealing with psychedelics that we have to do something completely different than the regular way of how medical or psychiatry or research generally is done. And this is taking care of the setting, of course. So we have nice music in the room, and the patients are with headphones also, with eye shades. We have nice fake candles, nice fake plants, because it's a hospital room. But we have a nice environment. So in the depression trial, we had 20 patients. All of them were treatment-resistant major depression, which means that they had at least 2 different treatments in the past which failed, usually treatments with SSRIs, with antidepressants, and they're quite in need for something else. So they come to our study, and they get in our study 2 doses of psilocybin. The first is 10 milligrams, which is more like a low-medium dose, a kind of a preparation even for the higher one, which is 25 milligrams. Before these 2 doses, we have preparations, and the preparation we try to build the trust between the patient and the therapist, and the trust between the patient and himself. Because there's this thing that he needs to kind of really let go, and in a way we call it surrender to the experience, and not resist any material that comes in the experience. So it's quite a strong psychedelic experience. While he's experiencing it, it's very internal, it's very introspective, with an eye mask, and there's 2 therapists by his side. And they're mainly taking this unjudgmental, empathetical approach of just being there with him and supporting if he needs. But usually there's not a lot of conversation during the session. And then the integration is what's the process that's happening after, and this is an important part of the process, where they learn together, the patient and the therapist, how to transform these big insights from the psychedelic experience into something more of the day-to-day, so changes in behavior, changes in action, for this change to become very overlasting, and they need to really change their behavior and actions in the end, something in their life, and not just keep it at the mystical experience or cathartic experience, but really understand how it means and what it means for their day-to-day life. So this is the integration. So we're just going to start also with the results. So these are the clinical results. It's a very successful study. So these are all the 19 subjects that completed the study. The black is the means, the average of the depression scores. Most of our subjects were severe depression. And we see here after 1 week, the mean, that there's a big drop of the depression scores. 2.2 is the effect size. So this is a very strong effect size. And we can see that this lasts for 5 weeks. And there's almost 50% of our subjects are considered not depressed after 5 weeks from the high dose psilocybin session. And then 3 months after and 6 months after, we see already some increase in depression for some of the patients. Now it's important to think about what does it mean, this increase of depression. If they might need another dosing, they still need to do some process, but it might mean that we need to also just improve our model, and the model means the preparation, time of preparation, the time of integration, the trust in the therapist, maybe the quality of the therapist. It's not just the drug itself, it's the whole model, and we can improve also other parts of the model than just automatically think about another administration. So what is the mechanism and how it creates such a strong change even 5 weeks after or 6 months after? And there are a few ways to look at it. And the first simple way to look at it is the kind of sorry, this is the wrong. say pharmacomechanism at the title, so the pharmacomechanism of clinical outcome. And in this way, we kind of look at it in more like from the eyes of psychiatry. So we say psychedelics are 5-HT2A receptors. This is a serotonergic receptor that might modulate the serotonin system and therefore lead to long-term changes in depression, which is related to serotonin. We can also say that we know from the acute state of psychedelics that there's increased communication between different parts of the brain and decreased integration of the default mode network, which is a network that relates to the sense of self. And that might lead to this decreased rigidity of the depressed state, which lead to the long-term changes. But this is a simple way to look at it. The more accurate way to add to it, and both of these explanations are right, is the psychomechanism. And to see that 5-HT2A receptors decrease the DMN, the network of the self, increase communication, connectivity between different regions in the brain, that these biological, pharmacological kind of changes in the right set and setting create a certain experience, with the right intention create a certain experience, and that experience leads to long-term changes. And these are two ways to look at what is the mechanism of change. So the psychological mechanism and the pharmacological mechanism. So we know that we work with a model that the mystical experience or the peak experience is the important part of what creates the change in these patients. And the beginning of the psychedelic therapy was in the 50s. Before that, there was psycholytic therapy and, of course, indigenous use. But the beginning of the model that we are using, is from psychedelic therapy with LSD. So Al Hubbard and Humphrey Osmond and Hoffer, they treated alcoholism in the 50s in Canada, giving 500 micrograms of LSD to their patients. So it's like a very strong dose, and they aimed for the transformative experience, the transcendental experience. And that's actually the model that we're working with. So in the 60s, this model moved to Bill Richards and Stan Grof and Walter Pahnke. Stan Grof and Bill Richards are still working today. And Walter Pahnke and Bill Richards defined the mystical experience based on different literature. So Abraham Maslow or Stace, and they defined the mystical experience or the psychedelic peak experience as the experience of unity or the loss of sense of self, which is an important dimension of this experience, transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, so usually it's a joyful experience, sense of awe, so there's usually amazement, full of awe and respect to the experience, meaningfulness of psychological or philosophical insight, so every insight from that experience seems very meaningful, ineffability, which means it's hard to describe in words, and paradoxicality means it's that the opposition seems to merge. And these are the dimensions of the mystical experience. Abraham Maslow was also talking about the peak experience. It's pretty much the same definition of peak and mystical, and its peak is an attempt to secularize the experience. And Abraham Maslow said that the peak experience is part of our human potential, and this is a natural experience, an important experience that happens to people, and we can reach there in different ways. Some are spontaneous and some are direct, and it's not necessarily that we reach there only with psychedelics. And Maslow was saying that the peak experience leads to self-actualization. And he described, maybe you know this pyramid of needs of Maslow, and the self-actualization is at the top. And Maslow described self-actualized people as people that are more spontaneous, more autonomous, more compassionate, more caring and accepting themselves and others. So the idea is that a peak experience leads to self-actualization, and also self-actualized people have more peak experiences. And this is a model that people at the 60s were working with, and kind of showing that the peak experience in the psychedelic therapy was leading to self-actualization, and they use measures of self-actualization and peak experience. So these are Walter Pahnke and Stan Grof and Bill Richards. And this paper from 1977, this is the last paper from the old days of psychedelic therapy. And this is a paper by Bill Richards. And we see that Bill Richards continues this tradition today in Johns Hopkins. So 2006, kind of part of the renaissance of psychedelic therapy, they showed at Johns Hopkins that the mystical experience is related to how meaningful was the experience and how significant it was. And they show that the mystical experience leads to increases in openness in healthy volunteers. They show that the mystical experience relates to positive clinical outcomes in the treatment of tobacco addiction, and that the mystical experience is related to the clinical outcomes in alcohol addiction, and that relates to the clinical outcomes in end-of-life anxiety, so reduced anxiety. And this is a study from last year of Johns Hopkins and NYU. So we asked the same question about our study with depression. We're the first group that's doing a depression study with psilocybin. And we asked the same question, but we also wanted to relate it to different aspects of the experience. So we're using this altered state of consciousness questionnaire, and it can be divided to different dimensions of the experience. And Chris showed you this questionnaire before. And these four, from experience of unity to insightfulness, they're part of the peak experience. Here it's called oceanic boundlessness, but it's pretty much the same definition as peak or mystical experience. And these are experience of unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, and insightfulness. And there are other more perceptual items like imagery. So we split our group to the ones who responded to therapy at 5 weeks and the one who did not respond. Okay, so it's pretty much 50-50 split. Responders are in purple and non-responders are at orange. And response means more than a 50% reduction in depression scores. So we see here that the responders in purple had a stronger experience of unity, a stronger spiritual experience, a stronger blissful state, stronger insightfulness. But then we see that the perceptual items were pretty much the same. Disembodiment was pretty much the same. Change in meaning was pretty much the same. And it kind of shows the specificity of how the mystical experience is related to the clinical outcomes. Another thing we can see here is that anxiety was stronger in the non-responders. And this will relate to the idea of resistance. So sometimes some of our subjects, in a way, they resist and create anxiety in the session, and whenever they try to push away the psychedelic kind of material that comes, and that creates anxiety. Might be related to the idea of they're not able to let go, but it's not necessarily their kind of fault or something like this. It might be that something is missing in the setting, something is missing in the relationship with the therapists. Okay, so these are the specific items, specific questions from the same questionnaire, the altered state of consciousness questionnaire, just to kind of emphasize this idea. At the top are the items that correlate the strongest with the clinical outcomes, and at the bottom is the ones that are negatively correlated. So from the top, I felt particularly profound. I had particularly inventive ideas. I experienced a profound inner peace. Worries and fears of everyday life felt irrelevant. I felt one with my surroundings. I experienced past, present, and future as a unity. Oppositions and contradictions seemed to resolve. Many things appeared incredibly funny to me. I felt connected to a higher power. I experienced boundless joy. So you see that these very much are similar to how I defined the mystical experience. And from the bottom, time passed slowly in a painful way. I felt threatened. I had a feeling of unbearable emptiness. I had a feeling that something terrible was going to happen. I felt tortured. I felt as if I was half asleep. I experienced everything as frighteningly distorted. I felt paralyzed. I was scared without knowing why. So these are the items that are kind of counter-therapeutic. I want to emphasize that none of our patients had a worsening of the symptoms. So patients with these experiences did not have a worsening of the symptoms. They did not become more depressed, but they just had a less positive clinical outcome. Another thing to consider here that sometimes we actually think that these experiences are quite important, an important part of the therapeutic process. But the question, do they resolve, do the patients manage to resolve them during the experience? So a lot of times we promote the idea of like looking into the fears and the idea of going in the fears and through the fears. And the question if they manage to resolve the fears during the session, or did they stay with the fear the whole session? And if they stayed with the fear the whole session, maybe it wasn't therapeutic. But if they manage to resolve it, this is probably a therapeutic process. So one imaging part of our study was looking at the default mode network, and I'm going to show you a result that we published 4 days ago, And this is changes in the default mode network 1 day after the therapy. So we know from other studies in our lab and other labs that there are changes in the default mode network under the influence of psychedelics. The default mode network is a network that's related to the experience of the self, and it's considered as the network of the self. So we looked at integration of the default mode network, which means how different nodes, so the nodes are the purple nodes of the network, how they communicate with each other. And the strength of the communication with each other is considered the integration. And we see with different psychedelics, with psilocybin, with LSD, with ayahuasca, that there's a decreased integration of this network, which relates to the ego dissolution, to the loss of sense of self. So it relates to their subjective experience of the loss of sense of self. Now, 1 day after the therapy, we see actually increases in the default mode network, and this relates to the clinical outcome at 5 weeks. So we choose this node here from the default mode network, and we see increased communication with these nodes. Okay, and this is quite a surprising result, but we have a speculation. It's still just a speculation of why we think it is. And it's important to remember it's just 1 day after the therapy. We don't know what's happening 1 week or 1 month after the therapy. So I would speculate that this relates to Maslow's idea that acute experience of the loss of sense of self will lead to self-actualization, to a stronger self. And that's actually what we see. We see that during the acute experience, there's decreased DMN integrity, and during the 1 day after, there's a stronger DMN, a stronger self, and this relates to Maslow's theory. But again, this is just speculation right now, and we still need to replicate it and see what's happening also later on, 1 week and 1 month after. Another big limitation of our study, and most of psychedelic study that claim that the mystical experience is important, they all probably right, it is important, but there are other possible mediators that we're neglecting in the story. So for example, Mendel looked at emotional openness during the psilocybin session, so how subjects relate to the music, emotional openness to music. When the music is sad, they become sad. When the music is happy, they become happy. And the intensity of how emotionally open were they to the music also relates to the clinical outcomes at 5 weeks. And there are other possible mediators that we don't quantify. This is important. We don't quantify the emotional breakthrough, the cathartic experience. A lot of times patients have a strong cry. They go through a strong cathartic experience, which very much relates to their personal kind of narrative. It's not that kind of mystical realm. It's more something that's related to their personal narrative. And usually there's a lot of crying and emotional breakthroughs during the session. Relieving of trauma is something that happens. A clear view of the self, sometimes going out a bit of the self makes it very clear to understand yourself. Re-experiencing childhood experience. The therapeutic alliance, which is the connection with the therapist himself, which by itself is very therapeutic. And the quality of integration, what happens after the therapy session. And these all are mediators that we're not quantifying and we should quantify. And I think these are also an important part of the story, and there's right now too much emphasis on the mystical experience.
You don't need to rush, we still have 15 minutes. Yeah.
Good.
The clock was a little bit low.
Okay. So I would finish this half part of the talk with the idea of experience efficacy, and kind of using the word efficacy is kind of hinting to psychiatry, where we talk about drug efficacy, how effective is the drug. But instead of that, we should think about, with psychedelic therapy, more about the experience efficacy. So how effective is experience? How effective is the mystical experience? How effective is the cathartic experience? And maybe different conditions need different experiences. So for example, in the MDMA therapy for PTSD, they looked also at the mystical experience, but they did not relate to the clinical outcomes in their study. They don't really have a mediator, but just talking with therapists, they kind of believe that there is kind of this release of trauma, which is also bodily and also the psyche, a strong release of trauma, a strong relieving of the trauma during the MDMA session, which allows them to heal the trauma. And so this is a different condition with a different experience that leads to positive clinical outcome. And in that way, we shouldn't just ask what LSD is doing to the brain, what DMT is doing to the brain, but what is the peak experience, what is the mystical experience doing to the brain, what is the cathartic experience doing to the brain. And it's not just the drug, it's how the experience changes the brain. This is a quote that I like from 1963, from an LSD research. Most authorities have no trouble in accepting the thesis that a single emotional experience may affect an individual for months or years, provided the experience is traumatic. So this idea that trauma can change a person for life, or trauma can change the brain for life, is very accepted. So if this is very accepted, probably also the idea, kind of the opposite idea, that a strong mystical experience or cathartic experience can change the brain for life, or can change a person for life. The transformative. Trauma is transformative, but for the negative side. So, I'm going to talk now about something a bit different, and changes in the amygdala after the therapy. And the amygdala is an area in the brain that relates to emotional processing. And we know that it's processing the whole emotional spectrum. So it used to be people used to think about it more as like a fear and anxiety, but actually we know that it's processing the whole emotional spectrum, including positive emotions. And we use a certain paradigm in the MRI to measure fearful faces and emotional faces. And this is a paradigm that's used a lot in the study of depression and antidepressants. So the idea that if we show to healthy volunteers emotional faces, whether they're fearful or whether they're happy, the activity of the amygdala will increase. For depressed population, the amygdala is hyperactive for negative emotions. So if you show fearful faces to depressed people, their activity will be hyperactive, more active than healthy volunteers. But we don't really know what's going on with happy faces. We know they're just hyperactive for negative emotions. SSRIs, antidepressants, reliably reduce the activity of the amygdala to emotions. So this has been shown in many studies. This is a meta-analysis here showing that in many studies, decreases in the amygdala was quite reliable after SSRIs. And this is decreases to negative emotions, like fearful faces. It's not really sure what's happening to positive emotions, if it increases or decreases the amygdala. So we used a similar paradigm, and we measured the subjects at baseline and 1 day after the high dose session. And we showed them fearful faces, happy faces, and neutral faces. And we just wanted to look what are the changes in the amygdala. So we have this nice provocative result that there are increases in the amygdala 1 day after the therapy, and this is the opposite of antidepressants. And therefore it's provocative, because we're kind of hinting here that it might be a different mechanism of change with psychedelics. So we see increases in fearful faces, increases in happy faces, increases in neutral faces, and it's specific to fearful compared to neutral. Now the question if this relates to the clinical outcomes, and we see that if we split our population to non-depressed and depressed, or responders and non-responders, the result is still working also for responders and non-responders, and we see that there's even a stronger increase in the amygdala for the ones who are not depressed. This is 1 week after the therapy, and the fMRI is 1 day after the therapy. So this relates to the clinical outcome, and now again, kind of trying to think what's the difference between this and antidepressants. Antidepressants decrease the amygdala reactivity to negative emotions, mixed results for positive emotions, and psilocybin-assisted therapy increases for both fearful and happy faces. So we speculate that this relates to the strategy of change, so the strategy of the therapy. Antidepressants are a chronic administration. There's strategies to relieve negative emotions. So this works for many people, but also many patients are actually saying that it creates a general emotional blunting. So the idea that in order to deal with depression, we just decrease the amount of intense emotions, so both for positive and both for negative, and this helped to kind of cope with the depressive life sometimes. And with psilocybin therapy, we're kind of confronting and working through these negative emotions. So a lot of times what I talked about, the process of in and through and working through negative emotions, and the idea of emotional openness that is part of the therapy. So they become more emotionally sensitive. And this is quite a different strategy, and this is still a speculation because this is just one day after the therapy session. We don't know what stays 1 week, 1 month after. I would like to give other kind of ideas from our study that relates to this. Roz Watts interviewed her subjects 6 months after the trial, 6 months after the high dose, and she found these 3 core themes that most of the subjects reported. And they reported 6 months after the interview, after the therapy, that they moved from avoidance to acceptance, so acceptance of their emotional state, acceptance of themselves, of accepting who they are. They move from disconnection to reconnection, reconnection to themselves, reconnection to their loved ones, people around them. And most of them suggested that previous treatments reinforced avoidance, so this idea that SSRIs can just create avoidance of the situation instead of dealing with it and working with it. Another example is from this quote here. I also see my dad abusing me again, something that has flashed into my head now and again ever since it happened. But, once again, rather than pushing the image to one side and avoiding the situation, I look him in the eyes and move through the discomfort and fear, in and through, in and through. With my demons fully revealed and presented to me, having looked my deepest fears directly in the eye, I enter a state where I feel completely elated, at peace, absolutely euphoric, the most relaxed and content I've ever been. And this is kind of a narrative that we see in a lot of our subjects, really dealing with kind of heavy personal stuff, dealing with their personal narrative, and kind of going through these fear and discomfort into something that is much more blissful.
Are these 2 patients or just one?
This is one. This is just a continuation of the story. So I would like to end my talk with 2 slides which are a bit more kind of a perspective on the whole field. This is the first one of them, and they're kind of more my personal view on things. So I was giving a similar talk a few months ago, and one of the women from the crowd, she approached me after the talk, and she told me that she was working in a drug company, and she got quite confused from my talk because in one part I'm showing brain imaging and neuroscience, and the other part I'm showing the mystical experience, talking about it, which has this kind of weird religious connotation. And she was saying to me, if you really want the approval of the FDA, you have to do proper science, you have to play the game. And I was a bit confused from that because I think she confused the game and proper science. And this is what this slide is about. So psychedelic therapy needs to go into a framework of psychiatry. Why? Because it's a drug. This is the reason. Maybe it needs to be somewhere completely else. But because it's a drug, it needs to fit into a certain framework, which is psychiatry. And the game means how we do the bureaucratic kind of procedure, how we get it approved, how we convince people that this is important, and we need to play kind of within the framework of psychiatry. And this means do placebo control, which we know that there is no real placebo with the psychedelic experience. They all know what we get. But this is part of the procedure that we still have to kind of play. And proper science is the seeking of the truth. Okay? And this is what science is about. And if the framework itself needs to change, then so be it. And examples of changes in psychiatry can be that talking more about the experience instead of drugs can be realizing the importance of the environment to the mental state. Okay, the idea of set and setting that is very powerful in psychedelics can be applied in psychiatry in general. And maybe even more being more accepted for the weird or the altered state. And because if psychedelic therapy would go into psychiatry, it might even reflect on what we think about other mental conditions such as psychosis. And it kind of can create a certain more acceptance of these altered states, whether they're psychedelic or not. Another slide, even more general view. I use the words here from a song of a friend, and I just like them, but it can be described in many ways. The within is the personal, the between is relationships with others, and the around can be the environment, the nature, the culture. And right now we're kind of, with psychedelic research, we're in a way focusing on the within, because we work in a framework of therapy, which is usually related to the self. Although it might heal a lot of problems with the between and the around, but the main intention is to work with the within. But we can try to think about how to use psychedelics in other ways. For example, a study about the around, about how people relate to nature, was published a few months ago, showing that people that use psychedelics are more connected to nature in a way that they feel more part of nature, so like a strong connection. It's not, I like nature, I love nature, but I am nature. And this was a relationship between psychedelic use and nature relatedness. Yeah, that's it. I'd like to thank Robin and David Nutt for supervising me, and the rest of the team. Amanda Fielding for intellectual support, financial support, the MRC, which is the government, for the support, which is quite cool that we're funded by the government. That's it. Yeah, questions?
Thank you, Leor, for this truly eloquent and excellent integration of different perspectives that are all important to understand the mechanisms of psychedelic transformation. So I'm sure there are more questions than time, but nevertheless, since we started a little bit later with the second talk, I suggest that we take some time for questions. If you need to leave earlier, feel free to do so. Try to do it as silent as possible.
I was wondering what your reasoning was behind your choice of taking treatment-resistant depressive patients instead of just taking regular depressive patients or any other patient group.
It was easier to get meetings in the beginning because these people are more in search for a treatment. So in a way, the ethics would be more easy on like weird kind of like new ways of treating depression because they really need it. So it was easier to get ethics for this group.
Okay, and did you control for how many treatments they had before? Were it always one or two, or
more than two? Or we did not control how much? More than two.
Okay.
You were talking about transforming big insights. My question is, what kind of psychotherapy did you use after the sessions? How many sessions? And do you have experience with different kinds of psychotherapy?
Yeah, well, we did not use any specific one. We kind of got advices from Bill Richards and how the John Hopkins team were doing it. Nothing necessarily specific. We did do only 2 sessions, but we're planning to do more because we think it's not enough for the integration.
A more general question. Do you think this kind of research you're doing will help to legalize psychedelics? Or if not, what kind of research it will need to legalize it for therapy?
Yeah, it's part of the process of medicalizing it as a first step is making it legal medicine. Definitely, it's part of the process. There are people who are more kind of now trying to do for-profit kind of projects for legalizing it also. But this is part of the process of just showing to the world this is important and kind of changing how people perceive it.
Thank you for the inspiring talk. I have actually 3 questions. So I'll just shoot them out. So the first one is analyzing the group of patients you treated. Is there any idea how you could distinguish predictably responders from non-responders on the psychometry side, maybe, or some neuroimaging, or maybe genetics, or whatever. Second question is, you mentioned improving the setting to improve the efficacy. If you would name one or two major factors that you would like to improve in your setting, or maybe the preparation of the participants, what would it be? And the third one is regarding the beautiful slide with the different frames, how to fit what in which frame. Do you have any feedback now from the regulatory authorities if they're ready to, innovate their regulations in order to, take a step towards psychedelic therapy as a modality versus just trying to press it into this mechanistic standard drug development?
So the first question about prediction of clinical outcomes, I believe the predictions are to the trust of the patient within himself and the trust in the therapists. And that can relate to different aspects. So like maybe some people and some personalities are less trusting, and these people need more kind of a stronger preparation. But it's not that these people are not good for psychedelic therapy, they just need a different approach or even more attention to them. So I'll be careful from any kind of claims of different personalities and how they fit into therapy. I think different personalities need to be kind of prepared maybe in different ways. I think that trust, the idea of letting go, is the important one. And then what relates to that? That's the question, and how you increase letting go in the session. So some genetic and the genetics or personalities, these are just something that's good to notice, but it's not necessarily they're not good prepared. The second question of different things to improve in the preparation you ask, or in general?
Yeah, the setting generally and preparation of the subjects for the experience.
I think more preparation we need. We also have not enough preparation. I think some of our therapists were not fully trained with psychedelic therapy, so they're more like psychiatrists, but they've not necessarily got the whole psychedelic experience. So people, let's say, sending therapists to cosmic care or to harm reduction places, like in festivals, would teach them how to really work with, if they need some training, how to work with psychedelic experience. Because a lot of times they'll have to work with psychiatrists, but it doesn't mean that they really understand the psychedelic experience. So the preparation and the preparation of the staff, therapists, both of these things I think are important.
And not so much the setting. So you think setting?
The setting, I think our setting was quite good. I mean, yeah, there were eye shades and music, and there's also music in the room. It's quite cozy. They liked it. I mean, it's still a hospital, Ideally, it can be nature, of course. This is probably where everybody aims to, right? Opening clinics in nature. But right now it's a hospital, and we do not change much right now. And what's the third question?
The third was regarding the position of the regulatory authorities to approve this kind of therapy in medical context. Do you feel in the dialogue that there is a change of perspective? They start evaluating experiences over drug, or are you still facing a wall?
So about the game and science, both are important. You need to play the game. You cannot just ignore the game in a way. There are, I believe, groups right now that are developing psilocybin for therapy, and they look at it quite mechanistically. And there is precedence from the 60s of a group that did it and failed in their therapy. So look at it very mechanistically, and it did not work for them. They did it with they played the game really beautifully. So they did the whole procedure was good, but they looked at the LSD very mechanistically without a lot of preparation, integration, without not a lot of attention to the experience. And that failed. But because it was so beautifully done, it was quite impactful, showing that LSD does not work. So there's a certain kind of danger of if people would go too much that way right now, but do it with hundreds of subjects, they would fail, which would be kind of a strong failure to the field. We are trying to do things our way and how we believe and improve. We have also realizations. We know we can also improve, and we're very much believing in the experience and the context and the importance of the seven setting. So in a way, we're trying to just show the way to others, but the big players, it's not us. In the end, there were people that come with a lot of money, and hopefully they would follow what we're doing and not change it too much.
Do you think that talk therapy or imagery will become maybe a first option in response to depression, maybe substituting SSRIs, or do you see more progress in cases?
No, we believe our next trial, starting a few months, probably 6 months, is for depression not treatment-resistant, and we're going to compare it to SSRIs also. So give some of the subjects SSRIs and some psilocybin and see who's better, and not just who's better, but also other aspects of change. You know? Yeah, definitely we are aiming for kind of replacing SSRIs.
Why did you do the study in a placebo group?
It was an open label. The next study will be with placebo. It will be, although it doesn't. They know, you know. We ask them. All of them will know if it's a placebo or a drug. So, I mean, we do placebo groups because we have to. But the question, why do we do that? You know, of course, a lot of other aspects like the attention they get from the staff. You know, the whole procedure might be helpful, but we don't really necessarily need to hide from them if it's a placebo or not. But the whole procedure definitely can be changed. Just the attention they get is helping. But next study will be placebo.
I asked this slide because we do an NSA study, a crossover study with a placebo group. We just started now with placebo.
Yeah.
That's why I asked for the same items.
No, it's good. We also a lot of we aim for quite high impact journals, and some of them papers got rejected on this basis. You know, but it's open label. There's no placebo, so it's important to do placebo because right now this is what you need to do, kind of. But in a way, it also doesn't really make sense a lot in psychedelic therapy.
Last question, Jonas.
You kind of addressed it already, and I'm not sure if you already said this at the beginning. Did the patient have only depression, or did they have any comorbid?
Okay, thank you very much, Leor, for your insightful and